John never thought he'd end up as a farmer, not in a million years. He was happy with his life in the city, working as a software engineer, living in his comfortable apartment, and enjoying takeout more often than he probably should. Farming was something his grandfather did, not him. But life has a funny way of throwing curveballs when you least expect them. "I'm sorry for your loss," the lawyer said, sliding the paperwork across his desk. "Your grandfather wanted you to have the farm, all 40 acres of it." John stared at the documents, memories flooding back of summers spent running through cornfields and helping his grandpa feed the chickens. The old man had been his hero growing up, tough as nails but with a heart of gold. Now he was gone, and he'd left John his most prized possession. "I don't know the first thing about farming," John mumbled. The lawyer chuckled. "Your grandfather said you'd say that. He also said you're a smart kid who figures things out. There's no requirement that you keep it running as a farm. You could sell it if you wanted." But something in John's gut told him not to rush into anything. This land had been in his family for generations. His great-grandfather had built the farmhouse with his own 2 hands. You don't just toss away that kind of history without at least taking a look at it first. The farm was about an hour outside the city, close enough that John could drive out on weekends. The first time he pulled up the long dirt driveway after the funeral, his heart squeezed in his chest. The red barn needed a fresh coat of paint. The farmhouse looked smaller than he remembered. But the land itself, rolling hills, a creek cutting through the back acres, old oak trees dotting the pastures, it was beautiful in a way city folks paid good money to see in paintings. "What am I supposed to do with you?" he asked the empty air as he walked the property line. That's when he noticed something strange. At the far edge of the property, where his grandfather's land butted up against a fancy housing development, something seemed off. There was a clubhouse and swimming pool that looked like it was partially on his side of the property line. John pulled out his phone and checked the property maps the lawyer had given him. According to the documents, that gleaming blue pool and at least part of the clubhouse sat squarely on his land. "Well, that's weird," he muttered. He walked closer, noticing the sign that read Oak Ridge Estates Private Residence Facilities. The place was swanky, all clean lines and expensive landscaping. A couple of women in designer workout clothes gave him strange looks as he stood looking at the pool area from what was technically his own property. "Can I help you?" A sharp voice cut through his thoughts. John turned to see a woman in her 50s with a perfectly styled blonde bob and enormous sunglasses perched on her nose. She wore white capri pants and a navy blue polo shirt with HOA President embroidered on the chest. "Hi there," John said, trying to be friendly. "I'm John Miller. My grandfather owned this farm, and I just inherited it. I was just checking the property lines and noticed that this pool seems to be partly on my land." The woman's smile could have frozen a summer day. "I'm Karen Wilkins, president of the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association, and you are mistaken. This facility is entirely on Oak Ridge property." "Well, according to my maps." "Young man," she cut him off, "these facilities have been here for years. Your grandfather never had any issues with our community. I suggest you check your facts before making accusations." Her tone made it clear the conversation was over as she turned on her heel and walked away. John watched her go, feeling like he'd just been patted on the head and dismissed like a child. His grandfather had always taught him to be neighborly and give people the benefit of the doubt. But he'd also taught him to stand his ground when something wasn't right. "Looks like I need to get a professional survey done," John said to himself, taking one last look at the clubhouse that was partially sitting on his land. Little did he know that this small discovery would lead to one of the biggest battles of his life, and that Karen from the HOA had no idea who she was messing with. John wasn't the type to back down easily, especially when he knew he was right. After his run-in with Karen, he hired the best land surveyor in the county. It cost him a pretty penny, but he needed to be absolutely sure about those property lines before he took his next step. 2 weeks later, the results came in. John sat at his grandfather's old kitchen table, spreading out the survey documents. The faded wood surface had seen decades of family meals, farm paperwork, and his grandfather's calloused hands working through bills. Now it held the proof John needed. "Well, I'll be darned," he whispered as he studied the official survey. Not only was part of the swimming pool on his land, nearly a quarter-acre of the HOA's fancy clubhouse and patio area sat squarely on Miller family property. The survey showed it clear as day, with official stamps and signatures that would hold up in any court. Armed with this information, John called the Oak Ridge Estates HOA office and requested to be added to their next board meeting agenda. The secretary sounded surprised but agreed to pencil him in. The meeting was set for Thursday evening at 7 p.m. in the very clubhouse that was partially on John's land. He showed up 15 minutes early, dressed in a clean button-down shirt and his best jeans. He might be a farm owner now, but he wanted to look professional. The HOA boardroom was all sleek furniture and beige walls. About 20 residents sat in neat rows of chairs, while 5 board members, including Karen, sat at a long table at the front. Karen's eyes narrowed when she spotted John taking a seat in the back row. After discussing speed bumps, a proposed change to the garbage collection schedule, and a heated debate about acceptable mailbox colors, Karen finally announced, "Our last item tonight is from John Miller, owner of the adjacent farm property." All heads turned to look at him. John felt his palms sweat a little as he walked to the front of the room with his folder of documents. Public speaking had never been his thing, but he reminded himself that his grandfather wouldn't have backed down. "Thanks for having me," John began, handing out copies of his survey to each board member. "I'm here because I've discovered an issue with our shared property line. According to this official survey, approximately a quarter-acre of your clubhouse facilities are actually built on my family's farm." A murmur ran through the room. Karen snatched the survey from the table, barely glancing at it before responding. "This property has been part of Oak Ridge Estates for years," she said with a dismissive wave of her hand. "Your grandfather never complained about anything, and frankly, that old farm is an eyesore compared to our beautiful community. If anything, we've improved the value of your property." John blinked, taken aback by her rudeness. The other board members glanced uncomfortably at each other but said nothing. "Well, my grandfather was a kind man who avoided conflict," John replied, keeping his tone even. "But the fact remains that a significant portion of your facilities are on my land. I'm open to discussing options, maybe a land purchase agreement or a formal lease arrangement." Karen laughed, the sound sharp and unfriendly. "Young man, I've been running this HOA for 15 years. We have the best lawyers in the state on retainer. If you pursue this silly claim, you'll regret it." She leaned forward, lowering her voice so only John and the board could hear. "That farm should have been sold to developers years ago anyway. Why don't you do everyone a favor and sell the whole thing to us for a reasonable price? We've been planning to expand our community, and that eyesore of a farm is standing in our way." The threat was clear. John gathered his documents, his face burning with a mixture of anger and embarrassment. He'd come here hoping for a reasonable discussion, only to be publicly threatened and dismissed. "I'll be in touch," was all he managed to say before walking out. As he drove back to the farmhouse, his grandfather's voice seemed to echo in his mind. "Remember, Johnny, land is the only thing they aren't making more of. Hold on to it tight." That night, as John sat on the front porch watching the sun set over his fields, something shifted inside him. He tried to be reasonable. He played by the rules, and he'd been treated like dirt. "You want a fight, Karen?" he whispered to the darkening sky. "Then I'll give you one, but we're going to play by my rules now." The weeks following John's confrontation with the HOA board were surprisingly quiet. Too quiet, actually. John knew better than to think Karen had simply given up. His grandfather used to say that silence before a storm was nature's warning sign. One crisp Tuesday morning, John was fixing the old tractor in the barn when he noticed an unfamiliar truck driving slowly along his property line. He wiped his greasy hands on a rag and walked over to investigate. Through the trees, he could make out 2 men in Oak Ridge Estates maintenance uniforms. They were planting new shrubs right on the disputed boundary. "Morning," John called out as he approached. "You fellas know you're working on my land." The workers looked up, startled. "We were told this is HOA property," one of them said. "Ms. Wilkins gave us specific instructions to beautify this area." "I bet she did," John muttered. "Well, just so you know, according to an official survey, you're about 10 feet over the property line." The men glanced at each other uncomfortably before packing up their tools. John had a feeling this wouldn't be the last mistake at his property line. Sure enough, 3 days later, John spotted Karen herself walking along the edge of his farm, taking pictures with her phone. When she saw him watching from the porch, she smiled coldly and waved, as if daring him to confront her again. Then the notices started coming. The first was a letter from the county claiming his tractor violated noise ordinances. John found this particularly ridiculous since the farm was zoned for agricultural use and he hardly ever ran the tractor before 8 a.m. Next came a citation for unsightly agricultural equipment visible from a residential area. Apparently, his grandfather's old barn was now considered an eyesore. The final straw was a formal complaint filed by the Oak Ridge Estates HOA claiming his property decreased neighboring home values and was a public nuisance. The document was signed by Karen as HOA president. "This is getting ridiculous," John said to himself as he added the latest letter to his growing pile of harassment evidence. That evening, as John was making dinner, a black luxury SUV pulled up his driveway. Through the kitchen window, he watched as a man in an expensive suit stepped out, carrying a leather folder. John wiped his hands and went to meet him. "John Miller?" the man asked, flashing a practiced smile. "I'm Tom Reynolds, representing Oak Ridge Development Group. I'll get right to the point. We'd like to make you an offer on your property." He handed John an official-looking document. John scanned it quickly. They were offering to buy his entire farm for 30% below market value. "We're prepared to settle all outstanding disputes as part of this purchase," Tom continued smoothly. Ms. Wilkins thought this might be the most straightforward solution for everyone involved. "I bet she did," John replied. "And if I refuse?" Tom's smile dimmed slightly. "Well, there are the ongoing code violations to consider. Legal battles can be quite costly and time-consuming. Ms. Wilkins felt this offer was quite generous under the circumstances." John handed the offer back. "Tell Karen I'll think about it." After the man left, John sat on the porch steps, feeling the weight of the situation. They were trying to bully him off his land, plain and simple. He could fight each complaint individually, but they'd just keep coming. Karen had resources, connections, and apparently no shame. That night, John couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about his grandfather and what he would have done. Around 3 a.m., he had an idea. If Karen wanted to play dirty, maybe it was time to change tactics. The next morning, John called a lawyer, not just any lawyer, but Tom Chen, who specialized in real estate disputes and had a reputation for taking on powerful opponents. The consultation wasn't cheap, but what Tom discovered was worth every penny. "Your situation is actually quite interesting," Tom said, reviewing the property records. "Did you know the HOA expanded their clubhouse 2 years ago? They built that new resort-style pool and patio that extends even further onto your property. And here's the kicker, they never got proper permits for building on land they don't own." Over the next few months, John settled into a new routine. He kept his tech job, working remotely from the farmhouse most days. On weekends, he focused on restoring the old barn using money from the water rights payments. He planted heritage apple trees on the new land, varieties his grandfather had told him about. The farm began to thrive under his care, becoming a blend of the traditional values his family had always cherished and the modern knowledge he brought with him. Occasionally, he'd spot Karen walking the resort grounds, no longer in charge but still a resident. They would nod politely to each other, a silent acknowledgement of a battle fought and finished. His grandfather had always said that land wasn't just about ownership, it was about responsibility, history, and standing your ground when it mattered most. In defending his inheritance, John had honored that legacy in ways he never could have imagined. Standing at the fence line one evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, John realized that the most important boundary he'd established wasn't on any legal document. It was the one that said, "This far, no further." Some things were worth fighting for, not out of greed or stubbornness, but because they connected you to something larger than yourself. John leaned forward. "What does that mean for me?" Tom smiled. "It means, Mr. Miller, that you're in a much stronger position than they think. But here's my advice. Don't show your hand yet. Let's gather more evidence first." That afternoon, John installed security cameras along his property line. He set up a detailed log to document every interaction with the HOA. And most importantly, he began researching the history of both properties. What he discovered would change everything. Not only was the HOA's fancy clubhouse partially on his land, their elaborate landscaping was being watered by a spring that originated on his property. For years, they had been using his water without permission or compensation. As John added this discovery to his growing file, he couldn't help but smile. Karen thought she was setting a trap for him, but she had no idea what was coming her way. Patience, he whispered to himself, channeling his grandfather's wisdom. The best traps are the ones they walk into all by themselves. 6 months after the initial confrontation, John was sipping his morning coffee on the porch when he spotted a fancy envelope in his mailbox. The Oak Ridge Estates logo was embossed in gold on the corner. Inside was a formal invitation to an HOA meeting scheduled for that evening. "Wonder what she's up to now," John muttered, suspicious of this sudden courtesy. He decided to go, dressed in his usual jeans and work boots. No point pretending to be something he wasn't. Walking into the clubhouse, he immediately noticed the change in atmosphere. Karen greeted him with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "John, so glad you could join us," she said, her voice sugary sweet. "We've been noticing all the improvements you've made to the old place. It's looking less rundown." Her backhanded compliment didn't fool him, but he played along. "Thanks. My grandfather would be happy to see it coming back to life." The meeting room was packed with homeowners. John took a seat in the back, feeling curious eyes on him. Karen tapped her gavel, calling the meeting to order. "Before we get to regular business, I'd like to share some exciting news," she announced, practically glowing with pride. "Oak Ridge Estates is planning a major expansion of our recreational facilities. We're creating what we're calling a Four Seasons resort experience for residents." She dramatically unrolled large architectural plans across the conference table. The drawings showed a massive expansion, tennis courts, an enlarged pool area, and a fancy outdoor dining pavilion. Homeowners applauded, clearly impressed. "John," Karen called out, making everyone turn to look at him. "Since your property borders ours, we wanted to keep you informed. Construction begins next month." She beckoned him forward to look at the plans. John studied them carefully, feeling a surge of disbelief. The expansion wasn't just near his property line, it extended well beyond it. At least a third of their planned resort would be built squarely on his land. "Looks impressive," John said cautiously. "But these plans show you building quite a bit on my property." Karen laughed lightly, as if he told a cute joke. "Our surveys show differently. Besides, we're improving the whole area. Your property value will increase dramatically thanks to our investment. You should be thanking us." Several homeowners nodded in agreement. John realized they had no idea about the property dispute. "Could I get a copy of these plans?" he asked. Karen hesitated before reluctantly having her assistant make copies. "I hope you'll be reasonable about this," she added as he was leaving. Fighting progress never works out well for the backward-looking party. The threat hung in the air as John walked out, plans tucked under his arm. Back at the farm, John called his lawyer immediately. "They're doubling down," he explained. "Planning an even bigger expansion, all documented on paper." "Perfect," Tom Chen replied. "Keep gathering evidence, but don't tip your hand yet." Over the next few weeks, John watched as construction began. Heavy machinery rolled in, trees were cleared, and foundation work started. True to his lawyer's advice, John documented everything. Each morning and evening, he walked his property line, taking photos and videos of the encroachment. When workers crossed onto his land, he recorded it. When they used his private farm road for access, he logged it. Most importantly, John had his entire property officially surveyed by the county's head surveyor, creating an irrefutable legal record of the boundaries. One evening, as John was updating his evidence file, he noticed Karen and several board members walking around the construction site, champagne glasses in hand, celebrating their progress. They were standing on what was clearly his land, toasting their resort as if they owned it. John snapped several photos, then ducked back into the trees. His grandfather had taught him the value of patience when hunting. "Let them come to you," he used to say. That's exactly what John was doing now, letting Karen walk right into his trap. By the time 2 months had passed, the resort expansion was nearing completion. The tennis courts were paved, the expanded pool area was tiled, and the outdoor dining pavilion, with almost half of it sitting on John's property, was being furnished with expensive outdoor couches and fire pits. Karen sent out glossy invitations to all Oak Ridge residents announcing a grand opening celebration for Saturday. Somehow, John's invitation got lost in the mail, but his lawyer got hold of one from a sympathetic resident. "This is it," Tom said when John called him. "They've invested over $2 million in facilities that are partially on your land. Now we have them exactly where we want them. What's the next step?" John asked, feeling a mixture of nervousness and satisfaction. "We're going to crash that party," Tom replied. "And I'm bringing the county sheriff and our full legal documentation. Time to spring the trap." As John hung up the phone, he looked out over his family's land. For generations, the Millers had worked this soil, respected their neighbors, and stood their ground when necessary. His grandfather would have been proud of what he was about to do. "Saturday it is," John whispered to himself. "Hope you're ready, Karen." Saturday morning arrived with clear blue skies and a gentle breeze, perfect weather for a grand opening celebration. John stood in front of his bathroom mirror, straightening his collar. He wasn't one for fancy clothes, but today called for looking his best. This wasn't just about property lines anymore. This was about standing up to a bully. "You sure about this timing?" John asked Tom, his lawyer, over the phone. "Absolutely," Tom replied. "Their guests will all be there, the catering will be set up, and Karen will be in the spotlight, exactly where she wants to be. It's the perfect moment to serve the papers. I've already briefed Sheriff Wilson, and he's meeting us there at 11 sharp." John took a deep breath. Part of him felt bad about ruining the party. Most of the homeowners were just regular folks who had no idea their HOA president had built their fancy resort on someone else's land. But then he remembered all the threatening letters, the harassment, and Karen's smug smile when she thought she had him cornered. At 10:45, John drove to the meeting spot just down the road from the Oak Ridge Estates entrance. Tom was already waiting in his car, a thick folder of legal documents on the passenger seat. The sheriff's cruiser pulled up a few minutes later. "Morning, gentlemen," Sheriff Wilson said. He was an older man with a weathered face and steady eyes. "I've reviewed all the documentation, and everything appears to be in order. Mr. Miller does indeed own the property in question." The three men drove in a small convoy to the Oak Ridge Estates clubhouse. The parking lot was filled with luxury cars, and soft music drifted from the resort area. Caterers in white uniforms bustled around, setting up elegant food displays. A banner hung across the pavilion entrance. "Grand opening. Oak Ridge Luxury Resort Experience." Karen stood in the center of it all, wearing a bright blue dress and directing staff where to place flower arrangements. She was in her element, clearly enjoying being the center of attention. Residents in summer attire mingled around her, champagne glasses in hand. The smile froze on her face when she spotted John walking toward her, flanked by Tom and the sheriff. "What are you doing here?" she hissed, keeping her voice low so nearby residents wouldn't hear. "This is a private event." "Actually," John replied calmly, "you're standing on my private property right now." Tom stepped forward, professional and composed. "Mrs. Wilkins, I'm Thomas Chen, Mr. Miller's attorney. We're here to serve you with legal documents." He handed her a thick envelope. "This is a notice of encroachment, trespass, illegal construction, water rights violation, and property theft." Karen's face flushed red. "This is ridiculous. We have permits for all of this." "Actually," John said, "you have permits for construction on Oak Ridge Estates property. According to official county surveys," he pointed to the documents the sheriff was holding, "about 1.2 acres of your new resort, including most of this pavilion where we're standing, is built on Miller family land." The sheriff nodded. "The property boundaries have been officially recorded with the county, ma'am." By now, several homeowners had noticed the confrontation and were moving closer, curious about what was happening. Karen glanced nervously at her audience, her perfectly maintained image beginning to crack. "This is a separate notice," Tom continued, handing her another document, "informing you that any entry onto Mr. Miller's property, including this section, will constitute criminal trespass as of midnight tonight." Karen sputtered, looking around at the resort, her crowning achievement, the project she'd been bragging about to residents for months. "You can't do this. We've invested over $2 million in these facilities," which is approximately the amount listed in our lawsuit for damages, unpermitted use of water resources, and illegal occupation of private property over the past 15 years, Tom replied smoothly. though we're open to settlement discussions. A murmur ran through the growing crowd of homeowners. Someone in the back asked loudly, "Did she build our resort on someone else's land?" Karen's panicked eyes darted between the legal papers, the curious residents, and the half-filled champagne glasses waiting to toast her success. The celebration was rapidly transforming into her worst nightmare. "The ceremony starts in 20 minutes, she said through clenched teeth. "You planned this deliberately." John met her gaze steadily. "I believe you once told me I'd regret challenging you, Karen. I wonder who's having regrets now." The sheriff cleared his throat. "Mrs. Wilkins, do you understand the legal notice you've been given?" Karen nodded stiffly, trapped in full view of the very people she'd been trying to impress. "What happens now?" asked a confused homeowner. Tom addressed the gathering crowd. "I suggest that HOA board meet immediately to discuss their options. Mr. Miller is willing to negotiate a reasonable settlement, but legally, this property belongs to him." As whispers spread through the crowd and people began taking sides, John stepped back. He hadn't wanted things to come to this, but Karen had left him no choice. Sometimes you had to stand your ground, even when it meant ruining a perfect Saturday morning party. #HOA Karen built a resort on my farm, then got caught in my legal trap. Part 7. 3 days later, John sat at his kitchen table, pen in hand, ready to sign the final settlement agreement. Sunlight streamed through the window, highlighting the scratches and stains on the old wooden table, marks of history that told the story of his family's decades on this land. Tom, his lawyer, sat across from him, explaining each page before John signed. That HOA's lawyer was there too, looking uncomfortable in the humble farmhouse kitchen. The agreement was straightforward. The HOA would trade the encroached land for an equivalent parcel adjacent to John's farm, plus pay fair compensation for years of water usage. John would grant them a 99-year lease on the resort facilities for a token $1 per year. "And here's the document for the water rights agreement," Tom said, sliding another paper forward. "They'll pay you quarterly for usage, with rates adjusted for inflation every 5 years." John nodded, signing his name. It felt good to have everything in writing, clear and legal. No more bullying, no more threats. Karen sat at the far end of the table, silent and stiff. As HOA president, she had to be present for the signing, but she hadn't spoken a word since arriving. The confident, intimidating woman who had dismissed John months ago was nowhere to be seen. In her place sat someone who looked smaller somehow, her perfect makeup unable to hide the defeat in her eyes. After the last document was signed and copies were exchanged, the HOA lawyer gathered his papers. "Well, I believe that concludes our business." "Not quite," came a voice from the doorway. John turned to see the older board member from the previous meeting, along with 2 other HOA board members. They had waited outside during the signing. "Karen, we need to talk," the older man said. "The board met last night." Karen's face paled. That meeting wasn't on the schedule. It was an emergency session, one of the other board members explained. "We've voted to request your resignation as HOA president, effective immediately." Karen stood up so quickly her chair nearly toppled backward. "You can't do that. I've led this HOA for 15 years. I built it into what it is today." "And you nearly cost us everything," the third board member said firmly. "The special assessment to cover these legal fees is going to cost each homeowner over $3,000. People are furious." "Not to mention the embarrassment," added the older man. "Building on someone else's land without proper verification. That's negligence at best, Karen." John felt uncomfortable witnessing Karen's public humiliation, even after everything she'd done. He busied himself with gathering his own copies of the agreement, giving them a moment of privacy. But Karen wasn't finished. She turned to John, her voice shaking. "You did this. You've ruined everything I built." For a moment, John felt a pang of guilt. Then he remembered the threatening letters, the harassment, her dismissive laughter when he'd tried to resolve things peacefully. "I didn't ruin anything, Karen. I protected what was mine, using the law rather than intimidation. The same law you threatened to use against me." The board members ushered a shell-shocked Karen out of the kitchen. The older man lingered, extending his hand to John. "The new board would like to start fresh, be better neighbors. Maybe we could talk about community events that bring the farm and our neighborhood together. Farm-to-table dinners or something." John smiled, shaking his hand. I'd like that. After everyone left, John walked his property alone, stopping at the boundary where his land met the now legally leased resort. Construction tape had been replaced with proper fencing, clearly marking where one property ended and the other began. He continued to the newly acquired parcel that had been traded in the settlement. It was good land, better than the piece the resort sat on, with more water access and southern exposure. Perfect for the orchard he'd been thinking about planting. His grandfather had always wanted to grow apples,